Grant Achatz is wrong. Darling, do we have a centrifuge?
No,
Vacuum oven?
no.
What about Aspergillus oryzae?
You bet you have, but you bought them last year saying you was going to make some miso with them, but you never did. You just let them die.
Awkward. Many of us go to restaurants to eat food that we couldn't make ourselves. Equipment aside, how do chefs do what they do, and what are their secrets? Well, there are a number of frameworks that can be used to create dishes and put elements together and create flavour. And this channel is going to be all about that. So if that sounds like your bag, click the subscribe strawberry down below. One of those frameworks is called food pairing or flavour pairing. Now, this was the genius idea of Heston Blumenthal, and in his restaurant, The Fat Duck, he used it to create incredible dishes like red cabbage gazpacho with a mustard ice cream, recognizing that cabbage and mustard shared similar flavors. Almond and foie gras, specifically benzaldehyde, which is in both, and also white chocolate and caviar. Now, that last one to me still jars, but it's an incredible dish, and obviously it's not Milky Bar chocolate and some crap caviar. It's going to be the best of both, and when you get that together, the flavor is really quite something. Only while useful, it's not entirely correct. So in Western cuisine, it holds mostly true. You know, foods that share compounds tend to go together well, and that's how our cuisine has been put together. But if you look at Asian cuisine, you'll notice that actually the ingredients they put together are disparate and separate and don't tend to share compounds. So it's interesting that both foods that share compounds work and also foods that don't share compounds work. And in terms of the original insight, it has to be wrong, because you can't have a theory that says, oh, foods that share compounds taste good together, but actually the opposite is also true. So there's something deeper going on. I think the difference here is a bit like Isaac Newton's theory of gravity. Stay with me. When he came up with this theory, it was this genius insight that helped scientists make huge progress in fields, particularly physics and engineering, where they understood laws of motion. And it worked very, very well. But one thing it couldn't predict was the precession of the perihelion of Mercury, which is just a quirk of its orbit. And you can't explain that using Newton's laws. What we need is a more general theory of flavour and deliciousness. So why should you trust a chef telling you that two of the greatest chefs who ever lived were wrong? Well, you don't actually have to take my authority on it, because I think in general, if the opposite of what a theory predicts is also true, then the baseline theory has to be wrong, or at least not entirely correct. And how do we test this? Well, one thing we can do is to cook something or create something that the food pairing theory says shouldn't work. And in this video, Grant Achatz is making big money statements about how red wine and maple syrup don't go together. Well, what if they did? Well, look, I don't think anyone is going to be adding red wine to maple syrup and drinking that and expecting it to taste nice. And it's not going to taste better than the red wine or maple syrup did by itself. But then that's not what cooks do. In the same way that you wouldn't necessarily add a really nice vintage red wine to another vintage red wine. Like, obviously they share a lot of compounds, but probably the one that you end up mixing isn't going to be as nice as either one of the others. So the fact that they share compounds or don't, I think in this case would be irrelevant. The point is, I think red wine and maple syrup can be made to go together. It's just a question of context. And so next week, I'm going to make this dish that Grant says shouldn't work. I haven't tried anything yet, nor have I ever cooked on camera, so this could go horribly wrong and be very embarrassing. But it's good to have some reputational skin in the game. Now, food pairing has come on a huge way since Heston's original insight, and Peter, Bernard and Johan from Food Pairing have developed the idea in a very deep way. And one thing we must consider is how an ingredient is treated and what other flavours we can get from it. I mean, clearly raw asparagus tastes very different to cooked asparagus, or raw beef tastes a lot different to grilled beef. It's this transforming of an ingredient and creating flavour that ultimately is the job of a chef, and putting them together and creating the right context for these flavours to come together and taste good. Now, take as an analogy an idea from Jacob Collier, and for those of you who don't know him, Jacob Collier is to music theory what Kanye West is to lyrics. We would all agree, musician or not, that there are some notes that just don't go together. They tend to clash and not sound good. Well, Jacob says that what has happened is that they're just in the wrong context, and that they can be made to go together in some way. You just have to find the right progression or the right chord structure in order for them to fit and sound good and to be in harmony. And there's a link to the video in the description below where he goes over this idea, and it's a great watch even if you're into music or not. I think it's fair to say that on average you're more likely to put together a dish that tastes good using ingredients that do share some compounds. There's just much less room for movement, if you like. In the same way that if you pick two notes from a chord or a scale, they're more likely to go together. So where am I going with this? Well, in other videos I've introduced the idea that it is the perceived complexity of a mouthful of food that governs whether it's delicious or not, or how delicious it is. Now we're assuming that that mouthful doesn't contain anything that's toxic or really unfamiliar or really strong. So in the theme of Einstein and general theories, a thought experiment. Imagine you were to create a mouthful of food from 4 ingredients that shared compounds, and you put them together and they tasted good. Now that's a mouthful of food, and your tongue and your brain is going to perceive that in a particular way. Now some of those flavours might present themselves at various times, but nevertheless, consider then to break that mouthful of food down again, but in a way such that the 4 items that you break it into no longer share any compounds. The perception of that food would be the same. The compounds present in the mouth, the aromas and flavours, are still there in the same proportions. So whether they share compounds or not isn't important. It might have been the route that you took to get there, but in the end, it's the perceived complexity, or like the overall sensation of that mouthful, that decides whether something is delicious or not. And that food pairing, when you really bottom it out, is just about building up complexity. And a safer way to do that is by putting flavours that are already shared together, but it doesn't have to be. Now, I've been trying to think of a few analogies to communicate why having something that is too complex might be a bad thing. Now, your neurons from your mouth and your nose have limited capacities, and your brain's ability to process them is also somewhat limited. Now, a mistake that I have made in filming some of these videos is that my microphone has been set at too high a sensitivity, and what happens is the sound that is recorded ends up being clipped or capped. And you might wonder why a telephone call over an old landline used to sound a bit weird, and some of that is because you have a limited amount of signal you can send through, and so you lose the nuance of the voice, you lose the deeper tones and some of the higher pitch notes and some of the other frequencies, and so the voice sounds a bit contrived and flat, I think you could even say. And in some of the original recordings here, my voice was loud on the mic and it was clipping, and so the information in my voice, whilst all went to the microphone, it couldn't be conveyed to the recorder, and so we lost some information, and my voice sounded grainy, it sounded flat, it sounded a bit weird. And does this suggest why some things don't taste good when you put them together? Is it that you've put two things together that create a signal that's so loud that actually it kind of quashes everything else and it can taste flat? Now, a real life example of this clipping analogy is corked wine, or cork taint. And cork taint is typically caused by 2,4,6-trichloroanisole, or TCA. And we are incredibly sensitive to TCA. And a small amount of it can overpower other things, and it can limit our ability to detect other stuff. And corked wine, while in really extreme examples tastes not very nice at all, in lower amounts the wine just tastes flat and kind of lifeless. And I do wonder whether this is because we've overwhelmed it with a stimulus of TCA, and that's what we focus on. And so the nuance of the wine is completely lost, even if those chemicals and compounds and aromas are still present in the wine. They're lost in the noise. Now, another interesting example of this is the chemical geosmin. Now, geosmin is responsible for that smell when you go outside just after it's rained, after a bit of a dry period. And it's produced by bacteria in the soil. And it just so happens that it is one of the chemicals that we are most sensitive to the point that we can detect 5 parts per trillion, which is vanishingly small. It's equivalent to 1 drop of water in 20 Olympic swimming pools. Ridiculously sensitive. And chefs have actually tried to incorporate this into food because it's such an incredible aroma. Why wouldn't you? But what happens is if you use it, it's much of nothing. You just end up with, similar to cork taint, just a muted plate of food, because we are so sensitive to it that the signal is so strong, it simply overpowers a lot of the other flavours and nuance. And so you lose that perception of richness and complexity and deliciousness. The fact is that individual compounds, individual chemical entities don't taste nice. But what does taste nice, to bring it back to music, is when a plate of food is a symphony. Now, an 8-bit rendering of Vivaldi's Four Seasons would still sound familiar, and you would recognise it as exactly Vivaldi's Four Seasons, but it doesn't have the richness or complexity of a full orchestral version. Now, I think gastronomy is moving into a new era, and one that is defined by complexity from field to fork and everything after. This is an era of creating new flavours and of creating new relationships with our land and understanding our microbiome and how that affects us and the foods that we eat and how we can improve our health. But that's for later. See you next week when I make the ballsy move of putting red wine and maple syrup together
in the same dish.
If you like this content, subscribe, click the bell, tell your friends, and see you in the next video. Cheers.